One thing is knowing your audience. And so because I've worked for local, national, and international agencies, every audience is different.
That brings up an interesting question. So when, there's so many people covering, say, like a certain topic, how do you stand out? Like how do you, carve out your own angle?
Depends on who your audience is and who you're working for. So right now, if I'm using my job at Al Jazeera as a senior producer as an example, we want our stories to have something different compared to what any of the competition has.
Here with Caroline, and a very old friend and a kind of media guru in terms of the journalism, storytelling, etc. And so this is my video series called How to Avoid the Annual Crisis. The annual crisis being the ever so exciting annual reports that our clients and all the nonprofits put out year over year. And our mission is to try and make those better, more effective, and more fun to produce. So Caroline, thank you for meeting with me today.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So maybe you can just give us like a little quick overview of who you are. Like what's your story?
Sure. So as Patrick mentioned, we are old friends. We went to McMaster together, studied communications and multimedia ages ago. And from there, I did a journalism degree and have worked in television broadcast journalism ever since, and have now moved over to the digital side of things, where I am creating content for social channels for Al Jazeera right now at the moment.
Which is exciting. And I also noticed that you were involved in anyways Our Toronto, which apparently has won a bunch of awards, which is pretty cool.
So I was one of the first producers of the Our Toronto program when the CBC decided to launch they launched like an Our Montreal and Our Toronto and Our Edmonton. So I was a producer of Our Toronto. I did that for 3.5 years. And it was a really, really special program to work on, because we just had to come up with an hour of original local programming every single week. And so we had the entire city to look at to tell any story we wanted to.
And how do you decide what to tell?
My host was Marival Tarouk. And so we looked at lifestyle, we looked at arts, we looked at sports, we looked at anything that was happening in the city. If there were any big shows that were coming to play at Mirvish, or if there was something happening with the Raptors or the Blue Jays, we would just reach out to their media contacts and say that we wanted to do a story with a certain player or an athlete or a chef. And because of the exposure it brought them in Toronto, often we got very positive responses and people wanted to be featured on the show. And so we just had a really, really great time telling local Toronto stories.
And how do you come up with like the angle that's interesting, right? Because it's one thing to tell a story, but how do you make it appeal to the actual viewer?
So one thing is knowing your audience. And so because I've worked for local, national, and international agencies, every audience is different. So if we're going to focus on Toronto, let's say, the people watching that program are living and working in Toronto, and they want to know what's happening in their city that they don't already know about. Because we could create stories that were long, or we could create stories that were short, depending on what the topic was. So let's say if it was a lifestyle piece and we had a great chef come in and we were going to do a cooking segment with them, we knew that could be really long, because cooking is so much fun and it's colorful and exciting, and it's really easy to have a conversation with your interview subject as you're doing something together. If we were doing a story with the Raptors, it was the same thing. I mean, oftentimes the hook for a story, when you work in television as long as I have, is really easy to pick out. You know what people are interested in. I think the other side of that lens is knowing how to pitch to media. And oftentimes that's where we get pitches where it's missed the boat on what's interesting. Does that answer your question? Or
yeah. I mean, it asks more questions, right? So like if I want to pitch to media, like how do I get your attention, and then how do I kind of hook you in, right?
So yeah, it goes back to, I think one of my first answers is you have to really know your audience. And you have to know there are so many programs, there's so many podcasts, radio shows, social media channels now. There is no end to a platform that will take your story. Someone is interested in what you have to say. You just have to know where to look. And so you have to do your research. You have to know, what does a local news program look to? How many stories do they want that are breaking news? How many do they want to be features? How many are investigative pieces? So you have to do your research before you pitch your story to a network or to a program or to a show.
And how far along does that story have to be? Like, do you have to have it like basically storyboard, or is it just like, here's the idea? Like, what at what point are they ready, to be produced?
Do you mean like when you pitch the story, how much of the material?
Yeah. So like if I'm pitching to you, isn't saying it's it's an email. I first have to get you to open that email, and then I have to tell you enough that that there's actually a story here. It's interesting, and that I'm prepared, right? Because it's easy to just say like, well, I have this idea about a story about potato chips.
Well, I think you need to tell me who your characters are, who's available for an interview, who's available to be interviewed on camera or off camera. Because if you have people that are willing to talk, but they don't want to be on camera, then you don't want to pitch that to a television station, right? Then that's something you're going to pitch to a print outlet. If you have any B-roll that's been shot or any type of material, anything that's been promotional that we can use in our segment, that's also really helpful. And if there's been any other coverage that's done on you already, that's important to share as well.
Right. So I'm assuming if someone ticked all those boxes, it's pretty much a slam dunk, whether you or someone is going to tell that story. Right. Yeah. But if I just come to you with, I have this idea about a story that's interesting, then it's basically saying, well, then you have to do all the work. Right. And you don't have time to do everyone's work.
Yes, that's right.
That's interesting. So when it comes to a story, so, when you talk about like, say, like print, for example, how do you craft, the perfect headline? Like, what's that kind of formula? Like, I'm assuming you probably see a story and it probably comes naturally to you. You're like, okay, this is like the hook. This is, what's going to, evoke, emotion. But to someone that's, trying to write a story, or, they have all the material, like, how do they come up with that headline?
So it takes practice first, I don't think anyone's going to get it right on the first day. What I do even now when I'm writing my headlines for some of my assignments is I go and I see what other outlets are using just to kind of generate some ideas, do some brainstorming. You are also limited now by character limits, which makes writing a headline even more challenging. I guess in newspapers, you've always been limited with a character limit with how much space there was on a page, but that is often what I struggle with, is to make sure that what I want to say is said in as few words as possible so that it appears on the screen and isn't messy. So there's a whole lot more that goes into writing a headline than just what words you're using. And I think I'm always considering that as well.
And what about like ChatGPT? Do you leverage AI at all to write, or no. You're not elevating and enhancing your
Well, but then it wouldn't be considered journalism.
Well,
I mean, if someone else is writing, if a bot is writing my headline for me, then it's not original content. I think that opens up a whole lot of worms that I at least do not want to get into. So I come up with all my headlines on my own,
which is great. Like for me, like if I'm using ChatGPT, typically I'll give it enough information to say, like, brainstorm, give me 10 options. And then from there, you can kind of figure out, like a couple maybe things that you didn't think about, and then you use that to enhance or elevate, which are ChatGPT's classic words to
okay, so I guess
better. So it's not so much like saying like write this for me. It's saying given this information, give me some ideas, and then it's like that research process. It's like the equivalent of like Google, right? Like if I want to Google something,
what I was just going to say is that I start out my day by reading what everyone else has already written about a subject that I'm covering, right? So I do get all my background information together and then come up with what I decide to write on my own.
So that brings up an interesting question. So when there's so many people covering, say, like a certain topic, how do you stand out? Like how do you carve out your own angle?
I think it depends on, okay, so again, it depends on who your audience is and who you're working for. So right now, if I'm using my job at Al Jazeera as a senior producer as an example, we want our stories to have something different compared to what any of the competition has, whether that's an extra voice, which is an extra interview. Maybe we have some exclusive footage, or we have access to an area that other people haven't been given access to. That makes us stand out, and that makes us different, because with agency like Reuters and AP, AFP, all those available, so much of the content is just regurgitated on different networks. So if you want your network to stand out, or if you want your story on your network's platform to stand out, it has to have something different from the competition.
Right. And that's kind of where that money is, right? That's the hard part, because everyone can tell a story to 80%. It's fine that 20% that's unique and that's more
it's about
interesting.
how you stand out. Like, what makes the CBC different? What makes Al Jazeera different? What makes the Guardian newspaper different? Why are those sources that certain people seek out? And it's because of the content that they're able to provide that others are not.
So when you're creating a story, do you have like a formula that like kind of like, goes through the different parts of the story to like, if you want to like, say like get an emotional response, like kind of like what is the thought process around that? Because obviously you can't just like, tell a story, right? You have to have like a certain formula of, like introduction and, the conclusion and, kind of, like what you see a lot is, you see the ending at the beginning, right? And then kind of like you work back towards it, and that's how I've been trying to do my storytelling. But what's your magic formula?
Well, I don't start at the end. I start at the beginning, at whatever's happening right now. That's usually my journalism 101 is the peg is what is happening right now. Why does this matter right now? And then if it's about something that has happened and is ongoing, I guess in a promo or something, then you would use that sensational moment or photo to capture your audience. But to tell the story, I always start with why you need to know this information now. What's the newest bit about it?
Right. And what about like story length? Like at what point do people kind of like, do you find that you lose interest or your audience loses interest?
Yes, 100%. Audience attention span is something that we compete with or struggle with all the time. And I think with social media, it's getting more and more challenging. When I used to work in television, all news stories that aired on the 6 o'clock news, let's say, were 1:30 or less. If you got 2.5 minutes to tell a story, it had to be something that no one else had and really, really had to carry the weight to take up that much time and had to be engaging enough to grasp the audience. Now with social media, the social videos I create, some of them have to be less than a minute, because if you're watching something on Instagram, how long do you sit and look at your phone and actually watch a full video through? So you have to
probably accidentally, like I left my phone on the counter and went somewhere else.
Yeah. So you have to be very creative and thoughtful in what you choose to write and what sound bites you choose to use. And you're always thinking about your audience and why are they going to click on this link, or why is this photo going to make them watch the full video? Or what about this story or this event is going to make them come here and sit through this entire piece?
So obviously you're in the media, and when someone pulls the annual report together and that it comes across your desk, what engages you or what doesn't engage you when you see these things? And then I guess second question is why would you want an annual report? Like in what context would that be useful to you?
Well, so any report that gives information about any type of study that's been done that encompasses, I don't know, because we cover so many different topics. So let's say there's been a report about how climate change is affecting, rising temperatures. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, sorry. But there's going to be a lot of reports that come out about climate change, and a lot of different groups are going to come out and want the media to speak to their specific group about, or their specific company about their report. And I think, again, you as the company needs to think about, why is your peg the most important? What makes you stand out? Why should the media choose you? And it's tough. Like, there is a lot of competition, but if you have a compelling story and you have a great speaker and you have good content, you make the job a lot easier for the journalist or for the producer.
So I'm assuming it'd be more powerful if they had like like a 2.5 minute or 1.5 minute video clip talking about the issue rather than like a 10-page PDF.
Yes, but also, like, everything, the shorter you can make it, the better. If you can give us a 4-slide infographic on the top, the main 5 points of your report, then that's great, because that's one of those is probably going to be a headline. So I think condensing information is really important. Having good summaries is helpful, and having the content that you're willing to share ready. Because oftentimes now with media, I work from home. A lot of the other producers I know also work from home. There's a lot less people going out in the field to do interviews. So I conduct all the interviews I do with people, just like we're doing now. I set up a Zoom, I do an interview with them, and all the footage comes to me from various sources. I'm not going out and shooting any of my own content. I'm not saying that as the journalists don't do that anymore, but they do, and they do a very, very good job. But there's a lot more of just this creating content from your home. And so if you have a story that you want to have told, you need to be able to provide the content for the story.
No, that makes sense. No, that's great. And in terms of kind of like the producing of the stories, what's the most challenging part?
I think sometimes it's having the visuals necessary to tell a compelling story and to tell an engaging story. It'll be something that happens, and you're like, you know that it's a good story, and there's a good hook, and there's a good peg, and there's even probably a great character, but you cannot create the content that doesn't exist. So sometimes you have to pass off on a great story.
So what about like in terms of like stock, stock video, stock images, that type of thing? Is that like a big kind of like no? Like to me, like we try to avoid stock in our work as much as possible, right?
I don't use any stock, anything. No stock images, no stock videos.
It's all real. No chat GPT, no AI.
No, and oftentimes everything has to be something that's happened today, like the day that you're covering the story.
So I imagine you must be used to it now, but like I'm sure like the amount of pressure that you have to kind of pull these things together very quickly. Yeah, I'm assuming you're an expert now, but I can imagine that'd be very stressful.
Oh yeah, it is definitely always a high pressure, very like anxiety-ridden environment, but I kind of live for that. I really enjoy working to a deadline. I find I work a lot better and a lot faster when I know I have to get something done. And it can be stressful, but it's also really gratifying when you see your work and you see like the effort that you've put into it and how many people connect with it. So
great. That makes sense. When it comes to social, the thing, there's just so much noise out there, right? So how do you like what's going on with social these days? Like in terms of like who cares? What platforms work best these days? Like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Are people still doing Facebook?
Well, so from Al Jazeera's perspective, where I work right now, I would say that Instagram and TikTok and then Twitter or X are our 3 largest social platforms. YouTube is also still quite popular. And I think because people do seek out, there's a very specific audience that Al Jazeera speaks to, and the younger part of that audience lives on social media. So I don't think that we have the same challenge that other social networks do in keeping our audience numbers up, because we are providing information that our audience is very, very engaged in. So I don't think that I agree with you that social media is very saturated and a lot of it is quite toxic, but I think there's also part of that social network that still provides important information. And that's where I work.
No, that makes sense. So I have one more question for you, and then my friend ChatGPT has a question for you, because if you've seen my videos, you know that there's always a bonus question from ChatGPT at the end. But my question is, so like when you're telling a story, and you know that there's maybe exciting parts, but that part of it is like pretty boring, but it has to be part of the story. So like when I'm thinking like annual reports, I'm thinking like for example the financials, right? These documents are always so full of like the stories, imagery, and then it's like financials, right? So how do you kind of like balance in your story? Like how do you add like make sure that you add the excitement, and that if someone's speaking and it's like a really great story, and the only footage you have is like that person that's like super boring, like how do you kind of like handle that, or do you just cut them out?
Oftentimes we just cut them out. You do a lot of cutting, a lot of trimming every single day. And if there's a way, let's say if there's part of a report that is very interesting but boring, or if you have a speaker that's giving really important information but it's coming across in a boring way, you have to find a different way to get that information across. So you take whatever your speaker said and you put it in text, or you make a graphic, or you just take a short part of their clip. You get creative with what you have and you make it work so that all the most important and relevant information isn't missed, but that it's also not bogged down.
All right. So yeah, every video I do, at the end I ask a question from ChatGPT. So I gave ChatGPT a few prompts, gave me a really boring question. So I said, make it more interesting. And what ChatGPT wants to know is, what is your secret ingredient? We'll call it secret sauce, for turning a mundane topic into a captivating story.
Finding the hook, because there is something interesting in every story that will be interesting and important to someone. So even if it's not interesting or important to you, you have to think outside of yourself and decide what about the topic that you've been assigned that day is interesting to someone else. And you just have to get creative. So I guess my secret ingredient is just being interested in everything, and not being, just being interested, I think, in everything, and wanting to learn and wanting to see why whatever I'm pitched or assigned is important to the person that has pitched or assigned it to me.
So do you ask that person, so when they say, here's the story, do you ask them like, why does this matter? Like if it's not evident why it matters, do you ask them like, what is that why?
I think sometimes if I'm struggling to find a peg for a story, I don't know if I would ask why outright, but I will definitely go back to either my editor or the person or the company pitching me and ask, what is it about this story that they feel is so important that needs to be told? And why am I not seeing it yet? And sometimes just that conversation leads to the answer that I'm looking for, or it gives you, both of you, something new to talk about and look into.
I guess it all goes back to, the thing that you kind of mentioned multiple times. It's just understanding who is the audience, right? Because once you understand who's the audience and what is the story, then I think the why, probably like 95% of the time, just kind of like stands out, right? Because you understand, the angle, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Awesome. Well, Caroline, thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking with you, and I learned a lot of interesting things, and I'm always trying to improve my storytelling, and yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome.